Welcome to the Everything History podcast for episode 52, De Caesaribus Part 6, the final part.
What we do here is go back.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
As I said last time, please note that I myself, Thomas, the narrator, interrupt at no point. So when the first person is used, that is Victor speaking, not me. Also to be mindful of, this book is not without flaws. There are many inaccuracies and prejudices that are written as facts by Victor. They are not. Much of the information contained within De Caesaribus is flat out wrong, but most of it is correct. This is especially true for the Caesars, or emperors as we call them, that the senatorial and equestrian classes despised. Victor also occasionally speaks in a manner that contemporary individuals might find insensitive. Section 41. While these events were taking place in Italy, in the east Maximinus, after ruling 2 years as Augustus, was routed and put to flight by Licinius, and perished at Tarsus. Thus the control of the Roman world was acquired by two men who, although they were connected to each other by marriage of Flavius's sister to Licinius's, nevertheless, because of their diverse characters, they only managed to coexist with difficulty for 3 years. For, you see, the former possessed the other great qualities beyond measure, the latter only frugality, and that, to be sure, of a merely rustic nature. Finally, Flavius Constantine received all his enemies with honor and protected them by allowing them to retain their properties, and was so conscious of his obligations that he was also the first to abolish the long-established and utterly frightful punishment of the forked gibbet and the breaking of legs. Consequently, he was regarded as a founder, or as a god. Licinius carried out tortures reserved for slaves in unlimited numbers, even on innocent philosophers of noble rank. He was indeed defeated in various battles, but, since it seemed difficult to suppress him completely and at the same time because of their marriage ties, the partnership was renewed, and their respective children, Crispus and Constantine, the sons of Flavius Constantine, and Licinianus, the son of Licinius, were admitted to the rank of Caesar. It was in fact made clear that this would hardly be a long-lasting agreement, or propitious for those who were added, since daylight was obliterated by a solar eclipse during those same months. Accordingly, 6 years later, peace was broken. Licinius was defeated in Thrace and withdrew to Chalcedon. There, after he had admitted Martintianus to the imperial power to assist him, the two were suppressed together. In that way, the state began to be ruled by the will of one man, Flavius Constantine, while his children retained their distinct titles of Caesar. In fact, it was at that critical time the rank of Caesar was given to our Emperor Constantius. When the eldest of the sons had died on the orders of his father, the reason is uncertain, suddenly Calocarus, commander of the imperial camel herd, insanely seized the island of Cyprus and pretended to rule. He was tortured to death like a slave or robber, as was right and proper. And the emperor turned his remarkable mind to founding a city, regulating religious practices, and simultaneously reorganizing the military. In the meantime, too, the tribes of the Goths and Sarmatians were subdued, and the youngest of all his sons, Constans by name, was made Caesar. Astonishing omens announced that because of him there would be turmoil in the state. In fact, on the very night which followed the day of his imperial appointment, the face of heaven blazed with continuous fire. About 2 years after this, he, Constantine, designated as Caesar his brother's son, who was named Dalmatius after his father, even though the soldiers vigorously objected. Thus, in the 32nd year of his reign, after he had controlled the whole world for 13 years and was more than 62 years old, as he was marching against the Persians, who had just caused a war to break out, he died in a country villa very close to Nicomedia. They called it Ancrona, as that star, so fatal to rulers, which they call a comet, had portended. His body was carried back to the city bearing his name, that is, Constantinople. This certainly upset the Roman people very seriously, since they thought that it was through his arms, his laws, and his merciful rule that the city of Rome had been practically renewed. A bridge was built across the Danube, camps and forts were strategically placed in many locations. The extraordinary requisitions of grain and oil which used to distress Tripoli and Nicaea quite seriously were removed. The inhabitants of the former of these cities, delighted that Severus was emperor, had given these as offering to their fellow citizen, but duplicity had turned the gratitude owed for these services into the ruin of later generations. Marcus Boinius had punished the others with a fine, because they had been unaware that Hipparchus, a man of outstanding genius, had been a native of their city. Fiscal abuses were severely repressed, and everything would have appeared to have been in accord with divine principles if he had not admitted unworthy men to public office. Although this happens all too often, nevertheless, in a ruler of the highest character, and in a state which enjoys exemplary moral conduct, faults, however small, are more conspicuous and consequently are easily noticed. In addition, they often do more serious harm, since, because of the esteem of their author, they are most readily accepted as virtues, and encourage imitation. Therefore Dalmatius was promptly killed, though it is uncertain as to whose instigation, and just 3 years later, more or less, Constantine II fell in a fateful war. Because of this victory, Constans became more arrogant, and at the same time he was willful and insufficiently cautious on account of his age. Furthermore, he was detestable because of the depravity of his subordinates, and passionate in his greed and in his contempt for the soldiers. And in the 10th year after his triumph, he was overthrown by Magnentius's criminal act, although he had certainly suppressed the uprisings of foreign tribes. Because he had treated too attentively the hostages taken from them, rather attractive boys, whom he had sought out and paid for, it was justifiably believed that he burned with a passion of this kind. Yet would that these vices had continued, for everything was so devastated by the awful, savage character of Magnentius, as is natural with a barbarian, and simultaneously by what happened afterwards, that people not without reason longed for the previous reign. It was also because Vetranio, an utter illiterate and quite dull-witted and consequently the worst choice because of his rustic stupidity, while he was commanding the soldiers throughout Illyricum as master of the infantry, had shamelessly seized supreme power, although he hailed from the more barren regions of Upper Moesia. Section 42. Constantius toppled him from the imperial power within 10 months by the force of his eloquence and relegated him to private life. He alone, since the birth of the empire, achieved glory through his powers of speech and his clemency. For when a large segment of both armies had gathered together, an assembly was held in the manner of a court, and he achieved by his eloquence what could scarcely be obtained by force or much bloodshed. This event adequately demonstrated that the ability to express oneself well is vitally important, not only in civil affairs, but also in military matters. In short, with this ability, even arduous enterprises are all the more effortlessly accomplished if the speaker excels in moderation and integrity. This is particularly evident from the case of our own emperor. Nonetheless, a severe winter and the closing of the Alpine passes hindered him from immediately marching on Italy against his other enemies. Meanwhile at Rome, because the common people had been corrupted and Magnentius was hated as well, Nepotanius, a relative of Flavius through his mother's family, was made emperor by a band of armed gladiators after the urban prefect had been murdered. His brutish nature was so destructive to the Roman people and the senators that everywhere the houses, squares, streets, and temples were filled with gore and corpses like tombs. Nor was this done by him alone, but also by the advancing troops of Magnentius, who had struck down their enemy on the 27th day. But already prior to this, since they suspected uprisings abroad, Magnentius had entrusted the Gallic provinces to his brother Decentius as Caesar, and Constantius the East to Gallus, whose name he had changed to his own, also as Caesar. They themselves met in quite bitter battles over a 3-year period. Finally, Constantius pursued Magnentius as he fled into Gaul and drove both adversaries to commit suicide by different means. And in the meantime, a revolt of the Jews who had criminally elevated Patricius to a sort of kingship was suppressed. Not long afterwards, because of his cruelty and violent disposition, Gallus perished on the orders of his brother, the Augustus. Thus, after a long interval of almost 70 years, the care of the state was returned to one man. Its newly acquired respite from civil turmoil again began to be disturbed when Silvanus was forced to assume the imperial power. This man Silvanus, you see, had been born in Gaul of barbarian parents and came from the military class. Furthermore, by his desertion of Magnentius to Constantius, he had earned his promotion to master of the infantry, though he was a relatively young man. When he had climbed still higher from that rank through fear or madness, he was slaughtered on about the 28th day during a mutiny of the legions from which he had hoped for protection. For this reason, so that there might be no rebellions among the Gauls, who were headstrong by nature, especially because the Germans were ravaging most of those districts, Constantius appointed Julian as Caesar, in command of the Transalpine regions, since he was acceptable to him by virtue of their family relationship. And the latter quickly subdued those fierce nations and captured their famous kings. Although these exploits were accomplished by his vigor, they nevertheless came about through the good fortune and planning of the emperor. This is so important that Tiberius and Galerius achieved very much that was outstanding when serving others, but under their own authority and auspices, their accomplishments were by no means equal. Moreover, Julius Constantius, who had been ruling as Augustus for 23 years, has hardly had a break from campaigning since he had been engaged in disturbances abroad, and just recently in civil ones. Through these campaigns he removed many powerful pretenders, and in the meantime he withstood an attack by the Persians, and he appointed a king to the Sarmatian people, while he was with great honor seated as a judge among them. We have ascertained that Gnaeus Pompey did this when he restored Tigranes, but very few of the ancestors have. Constantius is calm and reasonable in his duties, versed in literature to the point of elegance, and has a gentle and agreeable manner of speaking. He is tolerant of hard work and wonderfully quick at shooting arrows. And he is a master of his eating habits, of every passion and all his desires. He is reasonably dutiful regarding the respect owed to his father, but excessively concerned with that owed to himself. He is aware that the tranquility of the state is governed by the lives of the good emperors. These qualities, so great and so renowned, have been tarnished by his inadequate attention in approving provincial governors and military commanders, and at the same time by the incongruous character of most of his officials, and furthermore, by his neglect of all the best sort of men. And to that end, on a brief note of truth, just as no one else is more outstanding than the emperor himself, so nothing is more frightful than the majority of his subordinates. And that concludes Sextus Aurelius Victor's Liber de Caesaribus. Remember that you can contact me on the podcast Facebook page, or at the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.